Yeah, well, we've heard loads of really cool presentations, the magic presentation, the fantastic presentation by Kate. We heard the beautiful music by Xenia, and all of these experiences we had in those times were experiences that didn't just happen in our mind, they happened in our brain at the same time, because our brain is the physical substrate in which our mind happens. So how does the brain actually code our experiences, our thoughts? Brain science over the last couple of years has made tremendous progress in understanding how our thoughts are coded in brain activity. But first we need to understand what were we actually looking for when we're trying to understand how thoughts are coded in brain activity. Well, it's good to start with an analogy. And this is a very simple analogy, and I'm asking you to compare your brain to a CD. I'm not saying in every respect, but there is an aspect that is quite similar. And that is that the music on a CD is coded in the patterning of the pits on the surface of the CD. So it's the pattern that codes for the content. Similarly, in the brain, if we ask how our feelings or our childhood memories are coded in brain activity, they're coded in spatial and temporal patterns of activity in the brain. And the question is, can we somehow unlock this activity? Can we somehow try and decode or code break the mental states a person has, their thoughts, from their brain activity? Now, how would we go about doing this? Well, one way to do this would be to measure a person's brain activity. Now, with healthy human subjects, we can't normally just open their skull and look at the activity of the neurons. We have 86 billion neurons in the average brain. We can't just go in there and look what every single one is doing. So we're limited. The limitations we have to do research with healthy human subjects, we need to use measures such as, for example, magnetic resonance imaging, so classical brain scanners, and they measure the brain activity with a resolution that's quite good, on the order of a few millimeters, but not directly. We don't get the spiking of single neurons. We measure changes in blood oxygenation at each position in the brain. And what that gives us is, it gives us patterns of brain activity, or images. It's called brain imaging. Now, these images that you see, you can't compare them to the image that you get on a photo camera. Yeah, you go to the brain, you take a picture of it, and you show the picture around, and say, this is my thought. It's not as simple as that. In fact, in modern photo cameras, it's not that simple either. You've got lots of software in modern photo cameras as well. So instead, just being like an image of a pinhole, there's lots of complicated mathematical processing going on until we see these images. So this is kind of like the starting point of our science, is to look at these images. But we don't actually normally just look at them. I once had a beautiful conversation with a reporter from Deutschlandfunk in Germany, and she was an art historian as a journalist, and she asked me, well, what do you do? How do you interpret these images? And her thought was that we print them out, we put them on the wall, and we meditate about them and try and understand and decipher them just based on our intuition or feelings or whatever we have about these images, similar to what you do in an art gallery. This is far from the truth. We don't do this. We don't understand the language of the brain yet. We can't just look at this image and say exactly what it is, what the person is thinking of. We need the power of computers. And you can compare this to the problem that you have in trying to read the hieroglyphs before the advent of the finding of the Rosetta Stone. We don't know the Rosetta Stone of the brain. We don't know how to translate in detail these thought patterns of brain activity into the thoughts that a person has. So what we need to do is we need to do some code breaking. Now, in the Second World War, code breaking was invented in Bletchley Park, and the idea was to try and decipher the codes that the Germans were sending using their Enigma encryption machine. And we do something very similar, and I'm going to try and explain to you how this works. Just baby steps about how this works. To do this, I'm going to use one of the first studies that was published in this field. It's a beautifully simple study done by Jim Haxby and Alumit Ishai, who's here in the audience. And what you can see here is, on the left, you can see images people were seeing inside a brain scanner. And on the right, you can see sections through people's brains, and the hot regions are where the brain activity is increased, and the cold regions is where it's decreased. So what you see is that the pattern of activity is different for every one of these thoughts that the person has. When they think about a face, it's different than, say, a house or a chair, or a mouse or a cat or whatever. An interesting feature of these patterns of brain activity is that they're patterns, they're distributed patterns. It's not just one place in the brain that lights up when you're thinking about a face or a dog or a cat or whatever. It's a spatial pattern. We have to understand how the spatial patterns code information. Now, we did some research as well on these spatial patterns, and we found them to be quite individually idiosyncratic. So every person has a slightly different way of coding the same information. Possibly that's why we don't understand each other so well. Another point is that we can only measure the brain activity for a limited number of these thoughts. We don't measure it for every possible thought. We can't put a person in a brain scanner and read them 1,000,000 different words or something. That wouldn't be possible. So how can we deal with this massive information? Well, we do it electronically, digitally, with computer programs. We feed them into pattern classification algorithms, so computer programs that learn to recognize and re-identify these spatial patterns of brain activity. Now, the computer might learn to recognize these spatial patterns of brain activity, but you can always claim that your computer can do something. You have to prove that it really works. And how can you do that? Well, you just get a person to think about something, get a person to think about something, get a person to think about something, and suddenly it magically moves, turns up on the screen. So you don't know what the person is thinking here, and visually you might be able to inspect this and say, well, actually, this really looks like the pattern of brain activity I previously saw while the person was looking at a chair. And in fact, it's true. The pattern classifier can tell us that this is a typical pattern of brain activity. A typical pattern of brain activity. Magically, an arrow appears that appears when a person is looking at a chair. Now, these patterns of brain activity code the thoughts that we have. And they code them not only when we see objects, they code them also when we imagine the objects. That's a study that we did subsequently. So even if you're sitting there thinking about a face or a chair, the same pattern of brain activity emerges. So I'm going to show you a video from colleagues of mine, Nishimoto and Gallant, from University of California in Berkeley. And what you can see is kind of like the cutting edge of our ability to reconstruct the visual image sequences a person is seeing. The left is the video that they're seeing inside the scanner, and the right is the clip reconstructed from brain activity alone. This is quite amazing. You can see the glass is half full or half empty. If you're a skeptic, you'll say, well, there's all this detail that we can't see yet. But I think you have to give them quite some credit. This is quite amazing that you can reconstruct this amount of detail about a person's experiences from their brain activity. Now, we've done a number of other studies. We've been interested particularly in intentions. One of the questions was, how does the brain code our intentions, our plans to do things in the future, and can we possibly even predict the intentions before a person has made up their mind? So we did a very simple study. Cognitive neuroscientists always do these tremendously simple studies. People got to choose between a left and a right button, similar to what you have on this button pad here. Now, you get to choose between the left and the right button. I'd like to invite you all to do this simple experiment with me. Please choose freely at some point that you want to. Just spontaneously decide left or right and then lift the corresponding hand. So please use your free will now. There it is. Fantastic. Lots of free wills in the room. So this is basically the kind of experiment people are doing inside our brain scanner. And the question we had was, can we predict which choice the person is going to make even before they think they've made up their mind? I can't go into all the details of this study now, but I can give you the basic finding, which is that we found that we can predict people's decisions 5 to 10 seconds before they thought they were making up their mind. So while you're actually sitting there thinking about something else possibly, or you haven't made up your mind, we can already to some degree predict which choice you're going to make. And this seems strange. How can it be that despite the fact that I haven't decided yet, I haven't made up my mind, it seems everything is still under my control. I can still change the universe in one or the other way. How could it be that my brain activity gave this away? It seems as if we're carrying like a halo or a comet's trail of predictivity behind us. We're here and now, but actually it would have been possible to predict us several seconds back, as you can see in this image here. So the standard intuition we have, the lay intuition we have about the way we make decisions, is that first we have our mind decides, it decides independent from brain activity. We don't notice our brain. And then we move. Now, the brain science suggests now that first the brain activity pops up, Then our mind gets informed about this later, and then we move. So it's the brain triggering the decision, it's not the mind triggering the decision. Now, let's look at this in a bit more detail. So here's this image again. On the right, you can see the now, and you can see the predictive trail that kind of goes backwards in time, like a comet's tail. And the question is, what does it actually mean that we can predict ahead of time? Is this like domino stones, where you tip the first domino stone 5 to 10 seconds before a person chooses, and then there's a deterministic sequence of events that leads to the choice happening 5 to 10 seconds later? Well, you shouldn't use the word determinism in the presence of philosophers, because they're going to ask you to repeat the history of the universe in order to prove that it is really deterministic. So we'll do something a little bit simpler. But we can tell that it should, in theory, be possible for someone to interfere with this chain of events. We can, for example, just take away one of these domino stones, put them back, take them away. So it would seem that we can somehow interfere with this period of 5 to 10 seconds. So your naive intuition would first of all be, if you start doing this, that you'd say, well, I can just change my mind. I've made up my mind, my unconscious brain's made up its mind, now I'm just going to change my mind. But you can't change your mind because you don't know which choice you've made in the first place. So, I mean, it's a little bit of a trick there. Well, you can say something else could happen. I could knock you unconscious, or I could tell you that your flies are open, and you'd get distracted, and you wouldn't make the choice either. But normally, under normal circumstances, this chain of events would unfold as planned. So we decided to look into this period of productivity in more detail, and we devised an experiment that was specifically asking subjects to see if they could control this arrow, this, you can see here, the kind of time window backwards, if they could shorten it, make themselves less predictable. Is it something that people have under their control? Or do you have to live with this fact that you're predictable backwards in time? So can people control this and make it shorter, possibly? So for this, we devised a game where we call the duel game. And the duel game is kind of very similar to a duel. I'll just invite you to abstract a little bit from this. But it's the basic idea, are you going to be able to draw the gun first? Or is the computer going to be able to catch you during this preparation period? And the way it works is like this. You get a button, and the button is drawing. It's like you press the button, now you've drawn, and you have to, that's your choice of drawing now. And there's a light attached to it. And if you press the button while the light is turned off, you get a point. You win. Now, of course, we're measuring your brain activity, and our game is to play a little game. We try and predict when you're going to make up your mind, and when you press the button, we predict it and turn the light on. And if we manage to turn on the light while you're making up your choice, while you've just made your choice, and you're just pressing the button, then you lose a point. So this is a way of pitting against each other your ability to be predictable or unpredictable, then you get a point, or your predictability, you lose a point. And when we play this game with people, what happens is that people make lots of points if we turn off the brain-computer interface, and the people start losing, they're on par roughly, start losing a few points if we turn the predictor on. So that's the basic idea. If you can predict from early brain activity, then they've been unpredictable. If you can't predict, then they've been unpredictable. So what does this all tell us about free will? Well, there's a lot to be said about free will, and much more than can be said in 13 minutes here. One thing that we can at least say, conclude from this, is that we need to rethink the way we think we make our decisions. We think at the moment in time when we're making up our mind, we're free to make choices whichever way we want, and it seems that we're constrained by the history of our brain in ways that we don't really notice, that are not that transparent to us. But of course, a single experiment is not going to completely rewrite 2,500 years of history of thinking about the free will. And I like to think of this as like a starting block. At the moment, this whole field lives on very few experiments and lots of philosophical, theological, criminological speculation. I think what we need is 20 years of solid research on the way these decisions emerge in the brain, and then we should invite philosophers, theologians, criminologists back into our labs again and tell them about what we found. Thanks very much.